The day my son told me I was too old to understand modern finances was the same day I decided to take back everything I had built. I had spent 30 years growing Morrison family bakeries from a single storefront into a regional empire. And I wasn't about to watch Thomas drive it into the ground with his cryptocurrency schemes and venture capital nonsense. I sat across from him in the office that used to be mine, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. The nameplate on the desk read Thomas Morrison, CEO, in sleek metal letters that caught the morning light. My old wooden nameplate with Margaret Morrison, founder CEO, had apparently found its way to some storage cloister, more likely a dumpster. Mom, I appreciate your concern. I really do, Thomas said, not looking up from his computer screen. But the board agrees with my vision. We need to modernize, diversify our portfolio, expand our digital footprint. The board, I repeated. The board that now consisted of 3 of Thomas's business school friends and my brother-in-law Edward, who had always resented my success. The board that Thomas had reconstructed after convincing me to semi-retire 2 years ago at the age of 62. Yes, the board. Thomas finally looked up, fixing me with that condescending smile he had perfected sometime after his 40th birthday. Look, the business world has changed. What worked in your day just isn't viable anymore. My day? I felt heat rise in my cheeks. My day built this company from nothing. My day put you through business school. Thomas sighed, checking his watch. Mom, I have a meeting in 5 minutes. Blockchain integration doesn't wait for family discussions. He stood up, buttoning his tailored jacket. Why don't you enjoy your retirement? Isn't that what you and Dad planned? Travel a bit, join a book club, whatever people your age do. People my age. As if 64 made me ancient, irrelevant. I saw the quarterly numbers, Thomas. I remained seated, making him wait. Revenue is down 18%. The Westfield location is struggling. And I heard from Julia that you're planning to close the original downtown store. A flash of irritation crossed his face. Julia was my goddaughter and our head of HR, apparently one of the few loyal employees left. Julia shouldn't be discussing company matters with retired personnel, he said stiffly. And yes, the downtown location is underperforming. That building is ancient and the renovation costs alone. That building is our heritage, I interrupted. Your grandfather renovated it himself. Your father designed the kitchen layout. I created our signature sourdough bread in that kitchen. Thomas ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Heritage doesn't pay the bills, Mom. We're pivoting to a digital-first approach with centralized production and targeted distribution. The artisanal angle is charming, but it's not scalable. Scalable? I almost laughed. We have 23 locations in 3 states. We employ over 200 people. How much more scale do you need? We could be national within 5 years if you just trust me. His voice took on that sharp edge I'd come to recognize. The same tone he used with servers who brought him the wrong order or employees who questioned his methods. The investment I'm securing will transform this company. Investment from whom? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Pinnacle Ventures is very interested in our potential, especially once we integrate blockchain technology into our supply chain and customer loyalty program. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my blouse. I see. Well, don't let me keep you from your meeting. Relief washed over his face. He thought he'd won, that I was backing down as I had so many times over the past 2 years. I'll have my assistant schedule a proper lunch for us next week. We can talk more then. I nodded pleasantly and walked out, past the receptionist who barely recognized me now, through the modern open office space that had replaced the warm, collaborative environment I'd created. I smiled at the few employees who still made eye contact with me, pretending not to notice their pitying glances. Outside, I took a deep breath of the spring air. Then I pulled out my phone and made a call. Barbara, it's Margaret Morrison. I need to speak with you immediately about Thomas's plans for the company. Yes, that's right. I think it's time I came out of retirement. Barbara Chen had been my attorney for over 25 years. She was 2 years older than me and understood exactly what it meant to be dismissed because of your age and gender in the business world. Her office hadn't changed in all the years I'd known her, still the same reliable leather chairs, walls lined with law books, and the scent of good coffee. I wondered how long it would take you to come see me, she said, setting 2 mugs on her desk. Cream, no sugar, right? You remember, I said, genuinely touched by this small consideration. Of course I do. Now tell me what that son of yours is up to. I spent the next hour detailing everything I'd discovered, the plummeting revenues, the planned closure of our flagship store, and most alarmingly, the negotiations with Pinnacle Ventures, a venture capital firm known for stripping companies down to their most profitable elements and discarding the rest. Barbara took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me over the rim of her reading glasses. You know, when you transferred CEO responsibilities to Thomas, I advised you to maintain majority ownership. And I should have listened, I admitted, but he's my son. I wanted to show him I believed in him. I looked down at my hands, the small burn scars from decades of baking still visible. I retained 45% of the shares. Thomas has 30%. The remaining 25% is split among the board members. Barbara nodded thoughtfully. So you need to convince at least one board member to side with you to regain control. Edward will never support me. He's always been jealous that I built the business instead of his brother. My late husband's brother had always resented that I had been the business genius in the family, not his younger brother Richard. And Thomas's friends from business school are firmly in his pocket. What about the employees? Do you still have support there? I thought about it. Julia in HR for sure. And Frank Delgado is still our head baker. He trained under me for 15 years. Most of the long-term staff would remember how things were before. If they're still there. Barbara made another note. And your original business documents? The ones we drew up when you first incorporated? I frowned. They should be in the company archives. Why? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Because, my dear, you were always very thorough. And if I remember correctly, we included some rather specific clauses about company direction and heritage preservation. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. You think there's something in there we can use? I think, Barbara said, closing her notebook with a decisive snap, that it's time to remind everyone who built Morrison Family Bakeries in the first place. The next day, I went back to where it all began, our original downtown location. Unlike the sleek corporate headquarters Thomas now occupied, this building still had character. Exposed brick walls, the vintage neon sign I'd had restored in 1995, windows that steamed up in the winter from the warmth of the ovens. The morning rush was just ending when I walked in. Behind the counter, a young woman I didn't recognize was wiping down the espresso machine. But at one of the tables sat a familiar figure, Frank Delgado, head baker, and one of my most loyal employees. Mrs. Morrison. He stood up when he saw me, genuine pleasure on his flour-dusted face. What a wonderful surprise. Hello, Frank, I said, accepting his warm hug. How are you? Better now that you're here, he said, lowering his voice. Things have been changing. I glanced around. The cafe area looked much the same, though the menu board now featured drinks with names I didn't recognize and prices that made me wince. But through the large viewing window into the kitchen, I could see that much of our specialized equipment had been replaced with more standardized machines. So I've heard, I said. Is there somewhere we can talk privately? Frank nodded. My office. Though it's half the size it used to, Beth converted part of it into a digital ordering hub, whatever that means. As we walked through the kitchen, several bakers and pastry chefs looked up in surprise. Some called out greetings, while others quickly looked away, perhaps worried about being seen fraternizing with the old regime. Frank's office was indeed smaller than I remembered and cluttered with boxes that hadn't been there in my day. He quickly cleared a chair for me. I'm sorry about the mess. They keep sending new protocols, packaging designs, marketing materials. Half the time, we change everything only to change it back a month later. I nodded, unsurprised. Frank, I need to ask you something important. The original recipes, are you still using them? A shadow crossed his face. We're supposed to be transitioning to the new optimized formulations from central production. More shelf-stable, they say. Easier to scale. And how do they taste? Frank's expression said it all. Like they were created in a laboratory, not a kitchen. He hesitated, then opened a drawer in his desk. From inside, he pulled out a worn, leather-bound book I recognized immediately, my original recipe journal. I kept this, he said quietly. When they told us to turn in all the old documentation, I couldn't do it. These recipes, they're your legacy, Mrs. Morrison. They're what made this place special. I reached out and touched the journal, remembering the countless hours spent perfecting each recipe, the trials and errors, the 3 a.m. experiments when I couldn't sleep because I knew the sourdough wasn't quite right yet. Thank you, Frank, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You have no idea how much this means to me. Are you coming back? The hope in his voice was unmistakable. I'm trying to, I admitted, but it won't be easy. Thomas has changed so much. Frank nodded grimly. He doesn't come here anymore. Sends his innovation team instead, kids straight out of college who've never baked a loaf of bread in their lives, telling us our techniques are inefficient. What about the other locations? Is it the same everywhere? Worse in some places. The Westfield location is struggling because they forced them to switch to the new recipes first. Customers noticed immediately. He leaned forward. Mrs. Ridoviget Ezer and Acheld. Morrison, if you're planning something, you have allies, more than you might think. I smiled at him, a plan already forming in my mind. I was hoping you'd say that. Now, tell me about this rumor that Thomas wants to close this location. Frank's face darkened. It's more than a rumor. They've already started moving some of the specialized equipment to the central facility. There's talk of converting this building into some kind of blockchain bakery experience center, whatever that means. Over my dead body, I muttered. Frank smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. That's the Mrs. Morrison I remember. I spent the next week gathering information and allies. Julia from HR provided me with the current employee roster and organizational chart, confirming my suspicions that Thomas had pushed out many of the long-term staff in favor of his business school connections. Frank rallied the remaining veteran employees, discreetly spreading the word that I was looking into the company's direction. Most importantly, Barbara's legal team uncovered exactly what we needed in the original incorporation documents. It's right here, Barbara said, pointing to a clause on page 17. The Morrison family heritage provision. It states that any decision to close or fundamentally alter the original downtown location requires a 75% shareholder vote. I read the clause, memories flooding back. Richard and I had included this specifically because the downtown building meant so much to use. It was where we'd started our family business, where both our children had learned to bake, where we'd weathered recessions and celebrated milestones. Thomas can't close it without my support, I realized, even with the entire board behind him. Exactly, Barbara smiled. And there's more. Look at the section on core business identity. This clause was even more specific. stating that any change to the company's primary focus, defined as the creation and sale of artisanal baked goods using traditional methods and recipes developed by the founding members, also required that 75% vote. So his plans to centralize production with these new, optimized recipes would technically violate the company's founding principles, Barbara finished for me, as would any significant investment that shifts the company away from its core identity. Like a blockchain-focused venture capital deal, I said, feeling the first real surge of power I'd experienced in years. Precisely, Barbara looked pleased. Margaret, these provisions give you significant leverage. Thomas may have maneuvered you out of the CEO position, but he can't fundamentally transform what Morrison Family Bakeries is without your consent. I thought about my next steps carefully. He won't take this well, I said finally. He'll see it as a betrayal. Barbara's expression softened. You're not betraying him, Margaret. You're protecting the company you built, the company that bears your family name. Sometimes being a good parent means setting boundaries, even with adult children. I knew she was right. This wasn't just about me feeling pushed aside or undervalued, though those feelings were certainly real. This was about preserving something special that served our community, provided good jobs, and honored the legacy Richard and I had built together before his death 7 years ago. I want to call a board meeting, I decided. It's time to bring all of this into the open. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Thomas looked annoyed when I requested it, but couldn't reasonably refuse a major shareholder. I spent the intervening days preparing my case, gathering financial data that showed the decline under Thomas's leadership, and collecting testimonials from long-term employees and customers about what made Morrison Family Bakeries special. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully in a tailored blue suit that projected authority without trying too hard to look young. I wore the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary and my most comfortable low heels. At the last minute, I added the small golden pin shaped like a wheat stalk that had been my first company logo. Barbara met me in the lobby of the corporate headquarters. Ready? She asked. As I'll ever be, I replied, straightening my shoulders. The boardroom fell silent when we walked in. Thomas was at the head of the table, of course, flanked by his friends Jason and Michael. Edward sat across from them, and the company's new CFO, a young man named Brandon, who had replaced my trusted financial advisor of 20 years, sat at the far end with a stack of presentations. Mother, Thomas said, his voice clipped. And Miss Chen, I wasn't aware we'd be having legal representation at this meeting. Barbara is here as my advisor, I said pleasantly, taking a seat directly opposite Thomas. I believe that's allowed under our bylaws. A muscle twitched in Thomas's jaw. Of course. Shall we begin? Brandon has prepared a quarterly update and a presentation on our digital transformation initiative. Actually, I interrupted, I called this meeting for a specific purpose, and I'd like to address that first. Thomas's friends exchanged glances. Edward studied his water glass with sudden intensity. The floor is yours, Thomas said, with a gesture that managed to be both polite and dismissive. I took a deep breath. It has come to my attention that there are plans to close our original downtown location and to fundamentally alter our production methods across all stores. Brandon shifted uncomfortably. Jason and Michael maintained neutral expressions. Thomas's face hardened. That's correct, he said. As I've mentioned to you before, the downtown location is underperforming, and our production methods are being standardized for efficiency and scalability. I'm also aware, I continued, of ongoing negotiations with Pinnacle Ventures regarding a significant investment that would fundamentally alter the direction of Morrison Family Bakeries. Now, Thomas looked genuinely surprised. How did you... I founded this company, Thomas. I still have friends here. I opened the folder Barbara had prepared and slid copies of the relevant documents to each person at the table. What you may have forgotten or perhaps never knew is that our incorporation documents include specific provisions regarding changes to our original location and to our core business identity. As they reviewed the documents, I continued. Any decision to close the downtown location or to fundamentally alter our production methods requires a 75% shareholder vote. As I hold 45% of the shares, these changes cannot proceed without my approval. Thomas's face flushed with anger. These are obscure technicalities. The board has already approved. The board can approve whatever it likes. Barbara interjected smoothly, but the shareholder provisions supersede board decisions in these specific matters. It's quite clear in the documentation. Edward finally looked up from his water glass. She's right, Thomas. I remember when Margaret and Richard included these clauses. They were very specific about preserving the company's heritage. Thomas shot his uncle a venomous look. So what exactly are you proposing, Mother? That we continue operating an unprofitable location out of nostalgia? That we reject modernization and investment that could take this company national? I'm proposing, I said calmly, that we remember what made Morrison Family Bakeries successful in the first place. Our commitment to quality, to traditional methods, to being part of the communities we serve. I extracted several more documents from my folder. I've taken the liberty of reviewing our financial performance over the past 2 years since you took over as CEO. Revenue is down, customer satisfaction is down, and employee turnover is up. These aren't signs of successful modernization, Thomas. Brandon, the CFO, looked distinctly uncomfortable now. Those numbers don't reflect the long-term potential of our current investments, he offered weakly. Perhaps not, I acknowledged. But they do reflect the current reality, and the reality is that we're losing what made us special in the first place. Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. Times change, Mother. Consumer preferences change. If we don't adapt, we die. It's that simple. I agree that we need to adapt, I said. But not by abandoning our core identity. Not by closing the location where your father and I built this business from nothing. Not by replacing recipes that generations of customers have loved with optimized formulations created in a lab. I turned to address the entire board. I'm not here to take the company backward. I'm here because I believe we can honor our heritage while still moving forward. But Thomas's current direction isn't working. The numbers prove it. Jason, one of Thomas's business school friends, frowned at the financial data. These quarterly results are concerning, he admitted. I hadn't seen the customer satisfaction metrics broken down by location. Because Brandon only presented aggregate data, I pointed out, the traditional locations using original recipes still maintain high satisfaction scores. It's the modernized locations that are struggling. Thomas stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You've been retired for 2 years, and now you think you can just walk in and undermine everything I've built? The business world has changed, Mother. Your quaint little bakery concepts don't work anymore. The room fell silent at his outburst. I kept my voice deliberately calm when I responded. I built a quaint little bakery into a 23-location regional business that was profitable enough to put you through an Ivy League business school, Thomas. I understand money and business perfectly well. I met his gaze directly. What I don't understand is why you're so determined to erase everything your father and I created. For just a moment, something flashed across Thomas's face paint, perhaps, or guilt, but it was quickly replaced by the cold corporate mask he'd perfected. This meeting is over, he declared. We'll need to consult with the company's legal team about these supposed restrictions. By all means, Barbara said pleasantly. I look forward to the discussion. As we gathered our documents, Edward approached me. Margaret, he said quietly, I'd like to speak with you privately. I glanced at Barbara, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'll wait for you downstairs," she told me. When everyone else had left, Edward and I sat across from each other in the now empty boardroom. Despite our differences over the years, he looked genuinely troubled. "I didn't know about Pinnacle Ventures," he said. "Thomas told us he was exploring strategic partnerships, but he never mentioned them specifically." "And if he had?" I asked. Edward rubbed his forehead. "I would have objected. They have a reputation for gutting companies like ours. I may have had my differences with you, Margaret, but I loved my brother. I wouldn't want to see his legacy destroyed." This admission surprised me. "Then why have you supported Thomas's other changes?" "He's very persuasive," Edward sighed. "And I'll admit, some of his ideas sounded reasonable in theory. Modernization, efficiency, digital integration. But the execution has been problematic, as your numbers show." I studied him, wondering if this was genuine or just a strategic realignment now that he saw the balance of power shifting. "What are you saying, Edward?" "I'm saying," he replied slowly, "that I'd like to see the financial data for all locations over the past year, and I'd like to visit the downtown store. It's been too long since I've been there." It wasn't a commitment, but it was something. A crack in Thomas's support base. "I can arrange that," I said. "Frank Delgado is still head baker there. He remembers you." Edward nodded. "Richard always said Frank was the best baker he'd ever met besides you." The mention of my late husband's name hung between us, a shared connection despite our differences. "Tomorrow morning?" I suggested. "They still make the cinnamon rolls you like on Wednesdays." A small smile appeared on Edward's face. Those were always my weakness. As I left the building, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The confrontation with Thomas had been difficult but necessary, and Edward's potential shift in alliance could be crucial. With his 25%, combined with my 45%, we would have a controlling interest in the company. But I knew this was just the beginning. Thomas wouldn't give up easily, and there would be more battles ahead. As I joined Barbara in her car, she gave me a questioning look. "Edward might be coming around," I told her. "He didn't know about Pinnacle Ventures." "That's significant," she agreed. "What's your next move?" I thought about Frank Delgado and my recipe journal, about the downtown store with its history embedded in every brick, about the customers who had been coming to us for decades because they trusted our quality and values. "I think it's time I paid a visit to some of our other locations," I said. "And I need to speak with this innovation team that's been changing my recipes." Barbara nodded approvingly. "Reclaiming your territory. Good. And," I added, an idea forming, "I want to review all the communications about the Pinnacle Ventures deal. If Thomas has been keeping details from the board, there might be other aspects of his leadership that warrant scrutiny." "Now you're thinking like the businesswoman I remember," Barbara said with a smile, "the one who built an empire from a single storefront." "That woman never really left," I replied, looking out at the city I'd served for over 30 years. "She just got temporarily pushed aside." "But not anymore. Thomas had made a critical error when he dismissed me as too old to understand money. He'd forgotten who had taught him everything he knew about business in the first place. And now I was going to remind him and everyone else exactly who Margaret Morrison was. The next morning, I arrived at the downtown location an hour before opening. The pre-dawn air was crisp, carrying that particular stillness that bakers know so well, the quiet before the world wakes up. I'd spent thousands of mornings just like this one, arriving when stars still dotted the sky, ready to create something wonderful from flour, water, and time. Frank was already there, of course. Some habits never change. The rich, yeasty smell of proofing dough greeted me as I entered through the back door, using the key I'd never returned. Some part of me had always known I might need it again. "Mrs. Morrison," Frank smiled, flour already dusting his apron. and right on time for the first batch. I hung my coat on the familiar hook and washed my hands at the sink. Some things you never forget. Your brother-in-law called, said he'd be here at 7. I nodded, already surveying the kitchen. Despite Thomas's innovations, the heart of the bakery remained largely unchanged. The massive oven that Richard and I had imported from France 20 years ago still dominated the back wall. The marble countertops where we'd shaped countless loaves showed their familiar wear patterns. Even the ancient wooden proofing cabinet built by Richard's father stood in its original spot. I hope you don't mind, Frank said, gesturing to a spare apron hanging nearby. I thought you might want to. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Yes, I managed. I would. Tying the apron around my waist felt like coming home. My hands remembered what to do before my mind could catch up, checking the sourdough starter's texture, feeling the temperature of the proofing dough, adjusting the oven racks to their optimal positions. The team will be here at 5, Frank said. They'll be surprised to see you. Good surprised or bad surprised? He chuckled. Very good surprised. Most of them started under your leadership. They miss the old days. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen was alive with activity. The shock on the bakers' faces when they saw me quickly transformed into smiles, hugs, and a palpable energy that had been missing from the company headquarters. There were some new faces too, younger staff who had never worked with me directly, but who watched with curiosity as I shaped baguettes with the efficient movements of decades of practice. I didn't think executives still knew how to bake, one young woman whispered to her colleague, not quite quietly enough. I smiled at her. I was a baker long before I was an executive, honey, and a good executive never forgets where she came from. By 6:30, the display cases were filled with fresh pastries, the coffee was brewing, and the scent of cinnamon rolls, Edward's favorite, filled the air. Frank had outdone himself with this batch, adding a touch of orange zest to the traditional recipe. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful innovation I had always encouraged, respectful of tradition, but not enslaved by it. The front door chimed at precisely 7 o'clock. Edward had always been punctual, if nothing else. He paused just inside the entrance, inhaling deeply as his eyes adjusted to the interior. For a moment, he looked younger, less burden-like the brother-in-law, who had once been Richard's eager apprentice before corporate ambition pulled him in another direction. Margaret, he said, approaching the counter where I waited, this place hasn't changed a bit. Some things shouldn't, I replied, sliding a plate with a still warm cinnamon roll across the counter to him. Coffee? Black, 2 sugars, he said, and then looked surprised at himself for remembering his old order. We sat at a small table near the window, watching as the first customers of the day began to trickle in. The regulars did double takes when they spotted me, coming over to say hello, expressing delight at seeing me back in my element. Their genuine affection was a stark contrast to the corporate politeness I'd encountered at headquarters. Edward observed all this as he savored his cinnamon roll, making the small noise of appreciation that told me Frank's orange zest experiment was a success. You're still popular, he noted. I treated people like people, not metrics, I said simply. How's the cinnamon roll? Extraordinary, he admitted. Better than I remember, actually. That's Frank's innovation, orange zest in the dough. He's always experimenting, but he never loses sight of what makes the original special. Edward caught my meaning. Unlike Thomas. I sipped my coffee, allowing him to continue his thought. I looked at the financial data you provided, he said, lowering his voice. The decline in customer retention at the modernized locations is concerning. People come to Morrison's for something special, I said, not for something they could get anywhere. A young mother approached our table, balancing a squirming toddler on her hip. Mrs. Morrison, I can't believe it's really you. I smiled up at her. Emily Carter, how's your mother doing? Emily beamed. She's great. Still talks about how you catered her 50th birthday with those amazing almond cakes. She bounced the toddler. This is Lily. I've been bringing her here since she was born. The Morrison morning bun was the first solid food she ever ate. My heart swelled at this generations of customers continuing the tradition. She has excellent taste. After Emily moved on, Edward studied me thoughtfully. You remember all your customers like that? Not all, I admitted, but many. Emily's mother was one of my first regular customers. She used to come in every Wednesday for 30 years. Edward was quiet for a moment. Thomas doesn't see this part, he finally said. He sees spreadsheets and growth projections. He doesn't see this. He gestured to the bakery around us, now filling with the morning crowd, the familiar hum of conversation and clinking cups, creating the soundtrack I'd known for decades. That's always been the difference between us, I said carefully. I believe that good business and good relationships go hand in hand. The numbers matter, of course they do, but they're not the only thing that matters. Edward set down his coffee cup. I'd like to see the other locations, the ones Thomas has already modernized. I can arrange that, I said, hope rising cautiously within me. And I'd like you to meet with some of the employees who've been with us the longest. They have perspectives Thomas might not have considered. I think that would be educational, Edward agreed. I recognized a tentative olive branch when I saw one. After years of Edward siding with Thomas in our family disagreements, this willingness to listen felt significant. Richard would have been pleased to see I had always believed his brother and I had more in common than either of us realized. Over the next week, Edward and I visited 6 different Morrison locations, 3 traditional ones still operating with my original recipes and methods, and 3 that Thomas had modernized with centralized production and his new formulations. The differences were stark. The traditional locations hummed with energy and personality. Each had its own small variations that reflected the neighborhoods they served. The North End store featured more Italian-influenced pastries, while the university location offered study-friendly foods that could be eaten one-handed while holding a book. The modernized locations, by contrast, felt sterile and corporate. The baked goods behind the counter looked uniform but somehow less appetizing. The staff recited memorized marketing phrases rather than speaking naturally with customers, and most tellingly, they were noticeably less busy. It's like this most days, admitted the manager at the Westfield location, when Edward asked about the empty tables. We get a rush of regulars early, but they don't stay like they used to, and we've lost a lot of our afternoon business. What do the customers say? I asked. The manager, Sophia, according to her name, taglanced around as if worried about being overheard. They miss the old recipes. The new bread doesn't have the same soul, they say. And the pastries don't taste fresh, even when they are. Edward frowned. Have you reported this feedback? Sophia laughed without humor. To the innovation team? They say it's just resistance to change and that customers will adjust their expectations. But it's been 4 months and our sales are still dropping. On our drive back to the city, Edward was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, Thomas really believes he's saving the company, you know. I know, I said softly. That's what makes this so difficult. He's not trying to destroy what his father and I built. He genuinely thinks he's improving it. But he's wrong, Edward said, and it wasn't a question. Yes, I agreed. He's wrong. Not about everything. We do need to adapt to changing times, but not like this, not by sacrificing the very things that made us successful in the first place. Edward nodded slowly. I need to think about all this, about my role on the board and what Richard would have wanted. It was the most direct acknowledgement he'd ever made of his brother's legacy, and I took it as a promising sign. My next step was to meet with Thomas's innovation team, the group responsible for reformulating my recipes and redesigning our production methods. Barbara had arranged the meeting, making it clear that as a major shareholder, I had the right to review any significant changes to core products. The team consisted of 5 people, none over 35, who occupied a glass-walled conference room at headquarters. Their leader was a woman named Vanessa with a marketing background and an MBA from the same business school Thomas had attended. Mrs. Morrison. She greeted me with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. What a pleasure to meet the founder. Thomas has told us so much about the company's historical approaches. The slight pause before historical told me everything I needed to know about her perspective. I'd like to understand the changes you've been implementing to our recipes, I said pleasantly, taking a seat at their sleek conference table, particularly the reasoning behind them. Vanessa launched into a presentation filled with buzzwords about optimizing consumer experience and streamlining production protocols. The core of it, once I stripped away the jargon, was simple. They had reformulated the recipes to extend shelf life, reduce production time, and standardize output across all locations. And how has customer response been to these changes? I asked when she finally concluded. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. There's always an adjustment period with any significant change. We're monitoring feedback metrics closely. I see. May I review those metrics? Vanessa glanced at her team members. A young man with fashionable glasses handed her a tablet, which she reluctantly passed to me. The data was even worse than I'd suspected. Customer satisfaction had dropped by 37% at locations using the new recipes. Repeat visits were down 43%. Even their own blind taste tests showed a clear preference for the original formulations. It seems the adjustment period is not going well, I observed, returning the tablet. These are early results, Vanessa insisted. Once we complete the supply chain integration and fully implement the digital loyalty program. Ms. Taylor, I interrupted gently. I've been in this business for over 30 years. No loyalty program in the world can compensate for inferior products. People come back because they love what we make, not because they're collecting digital points. One of the younger team members, a man who had been silent until now, spoke up. Actually, Mrs. Morrison, I've been saying something similar. The data suggests we should reconsider some of the formulation changes. Vanessa shot him a warning look, but he continued. I grew up eating Morrison's bread. My grandmother would bring it home every Sunday. The new formula. It's just not the same. This small act of courage impressed me. And you are? David Nguyen. I'm the data analyst for the team. Thank you for your honesty, David. I turned back to Vanessa. I'd like complete access to all product testing data, customer feedback, and sales information for both the traditional and reformulated products. As a major shareholder with specific rights regarding core business identity, I'm entitled to review this information. Vanessa's smile tightened. Of course, we'll need to clear that with Thomas, but... No need, I said, producing the legal documentation Barbara had prepared. This formally requests the information under Section 7 of our shareholder agreement. I'll expect it by the end of business tomorrow. As I stood to leave, I addressed the entire team. I built this company by listening to customers, to employees, and to the bread itself. Sometimes the most innovative thing you can do is remember what made you special in the first place. David Nguyen caught up with me at the elevator. Mrs. Morrison, there's something else you should know. I held the elevator door. I'm listening. He glanced around nervously. The Pinnacle Ventures deal? It's not just about investment. Thomas has already agreed in principle to sell controlling interest of the company. My blood ran cold. Are you certain? He nodded. I saw the preliminary agreement when I was compiling data for their due diligence. Pinnacle would get 60% ownership. They're planning to keep the Morrison name but replace most of the operations. The downtown location would become a heritage museum, while actual production would move entirely to automated facilities. Thank you, David, I said, my mind already racing with the implications. I appreciate your integrity. My grandmother would never forgive me if I helped destroy her favorite bakery, he said with a small smile. Back in Barbara's office, I relayed what I'd learned. If true, this is a significant breach of fiduciary duty. Barbara said, making notes. Thomas can't sell controlling interest without shareholder approval, and he certainly can't negotiate such a deal in secret. Can we get proof? I asked. We can demand documents under discovery if we file a formal complaint, she said, but that escalates this to a legal battle that might damage the company further. I thought about it. What if we approached Pinnacle directly? Let them know that any deal Thomas has promised them is built on sand. Barbara considered this. Risky. They might simply accelerate their timeline or find another way to structure the deal. Or they might realize they're being misled and back out entirely, I countered. There is a third option, Barbara said slowly. You could call an emergency shareholder meeting. With the information from David, plus Edward's potential support, you might be able to force a vote of no confidence in Thomas's leadership. The thought of publicly denouncing my own son made my stomach twist. Despite everything, he was still Richard's child, still the boy who had once followed me around the kitchen, eager to learn the family business. Let me speak with Edward first, I decided, and I want to talk to Thomas one more time, give him a chance to explain himself. Barbara looked skeptical. You think he'll suddenly see the light? No, I admitted, but I need to know I tried everything before taking such a drastic step. Edward agreed to meet me for dinner that evening at a quiet restaurant near his home. To my surprise, he brought his wife, Charlotte, who had always been even more critical of my business decisions than Edward himself. I hope you don't mind, Edward said as we were seated. Charlotte wanted to hear about our visits to the bakeries firsthand. Of course not, I said, genuinely pleased to see my sister-in-law included in these discussions. It affects the whole family after all. Charlotte studied me over her menu. Edward tells me you're concerned about Thomas's leadership. I chose my words carefully. I'm concerned about the direction the company is taking, and I've recently learned that Thomas may be negotiating to sell controlling interest to Pinnacle Ventures. Edward's fork clattered against his plate. What? He can't do that without a shareholder vote. Precisely, I said. Yet according to a reliable source on his innovation team, he's already agreed to it in principle. Charlotte's expression darkened. That would explain why he's been so evasive about the partnership details at family dinners. Last month, I asked him directly if he was considering selling, and he said it was just a strategic investment. This confirmation from Charlotte surprised me. I'd always assumed she supported Thomas unconditionally. You don't approve of selling? I asked. Charlotte straightened in her seat. Margaret, whatever our differences over the years, I know what that company means to this family. Richard was so proud of what you two built together. To sell it off to some venture capital firm that will strip it for parts? She shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. For the first time, I felt a genuine connection with my sister-in-law. We'd spent years politely disagreeing about almost everything, but on this, the importance of preserving Richard's legacy, we were perfectly aligned. Edward looked between us with something like wonder. Well, this is unexpected. Life is full of surprises, I said, raising my water glass in a small toast. So, shall we discuss next steps? By the time dessert arrived, we had a plan. Edward would request a full review of the Pinnacle negotiations at the next board meeting, scheduled for Friday. If Thomas refused or continued to obscure the details, Edward would join me in calling for an emergency shareholder meeting. With my 45% and his 25%, we would have the power to take decisive action. But you'll talk to him first, Charlotte asked, her maternal instinct still protective of her nephew, despite her disapproval of his actions. Give him a chance to course correct? First thing tomorrow, I promised. I called Thomas early the next morning and asked to meet him for lunch. To my surprise, he agreed readily, suggesting a trendy restaurant near headquarters that served deconstructed versions of comfort food at prices that made me wince. He was already seated when I arrived, working on his tablet with a glass of sparkling water at his elbow. He stood to greet me, his kiss on my cheek perfunctory but not unkind. Mother, you're looking well. Thank you, Thomas. So are you. It was true he was as handsome as his father had been, though Richard's laugh lines had been replaced by a certain tightness around Thomas's mouth. After we ordered a reimagined Caesar salad for him, soup and half a sandwich for me, I decided to skip the small talk. I've learned about your negotiations with Pinnacle Ventures, I said directly. The real negotiations, not the strategic partnership you've described to the board. Thomas's expression flickered briefly before settling into a careful neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you are, I replied, keeping my voice gentle but firm. You're planning to sell controlling interest in Morrison Family Bakeries. The company your father and I built from nothing, that bears our name, that was meant to be your inheritance and your legacy. Business evolves, Mother, he said, his tone reasonable, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. The market has changed, consumer preferences have changed. To survive, we need to change too. I agree with that principle, I said. But selling our company's soul isn't evolution, it's surrender. He sighed, setting down his fork. I knew you wouldn't understand. This is exactly why I didn't discuss the details with you earlier. You're too emotionally attached to see the business realities. Then help me understand, I challenged him. Explain to me why destroying everything that makes Morrison special is good business. For a moment, genuine frustration broke through his corporate veneer. Because special doesn't scale. Because artisanal bakeries with their precious sourdough starters and hand-shaped loaves are charming local businesses, not national brands. Because to compete in today's market, we need capital, technology, and standardization. Even if it means losing our customers, our identity, our quality. Short-term disruption for long-term gain, he insisted. The Pinnacle deal would value the company at 3 times what it's worth today. 3 times, Mother. And what would be left of Morrison's after Pinnacle finishes optimizing it? I asked quietly. A name on mass-produced packages? A nostalgic logo on products that bear no resemblance to what your father and I created? Thomas's jaw tightened. You keep bringing Dad into this, but Dad's been gone for 7 years. He's not here to see how the industry has changed. Your father understood change, I said. We expanded from 1 store to 23 together. We adopted new technologies when they improved our products, but we never, ever compromised on quality or forgot who we were. And now you're using legal technicalities to block progress, he countered. Those heritage clauses were never meant to handcuff the company permanently. No, I agreed. They were meant to prevent exactly this kind of fundamental transformation without proper consideration and consent. Thomas leaned back, studying me with a calculating expression that reminded me painfully of when he was a teenager, trying to figure out how to get what he wanted. What is it you want, Mother? A bigger role in the company? A seat on the board? We can arrange that. The condescension in his tone stung, but I kept my voice steady. What I want is for you to remember who we are. Morrison Family Bakeries isn't just a line on your resume or an asset to be sold to the highest bidder. It's your heritage. It's your father's legacy. And yes, it's my life's work. So that's a no to the board seat, he said dryly. I tried one last approach. Do you remember when you were 10 and your father taught you to shape baguettes? How proud you were when customers bought the loaves you had helped create. A flash of something memory, regret. I couldn't tell crossed his face before he shut it down. That was a long time ago. Not so long that you should have forgotten what it felt like to make something real, something that brought people joy. I said, the company can grow, Thomas. It can evolve, but not like this. He checked his watch. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Of course you do, I sighed. Before you go, you should know that I've learned enough about the Pinnacle deal to take formal action if necessary. I'd much rather find a solution that doesn't involve legal battles or public board disputes. Thomas stood, straightening his already perfect tie. Is that a threat? It's a reality, I said simply. One last thing, Edward and Charlotte are aware of the situation now. They share my concerns. This, finally, seemed to register. Thomas's expression tightened. Uncle Edward has no idea what it takes to run a modern business. Perhaps not, I acknowledged. But he knows what your father valued, and he has a vote that matters. Thomas threw some bills on the table for his half-eaten lunch. I'll see you at the board meeting on Friday. I watched him leave, his back straight, his stride purposeful. My son so capable in many ways, yet so blinded by his vision of success that he couldn't see the damage he was causing. My own appetite had vanished, but I finished my soup out of habit. Waste not, want not, a lesson from my own mother that had served me well through the lean early years of the business. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Barbara. Received the information from David. It's as bad as we feared. Call me. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Barbara and her team reviewed the documentation David had provided, building a case against Thomas's leadership should we need it. I met with Julia from HR, who confirmed that employee satisfaction had plummeted under the new regime. Frank rallied the veteran staff members, ensuring they would be ready to help if a leadership transition became necessary. Most surprisingly, Charlotte, who had never shown interest in the business operations, before threw herself into researching Pinnacle Ventures' past acquisitions. The results were sobering. They dismantled every company they've touched, she reported during our strategy session at Barbara's office. They keep the brand names but outsource production/workforces and cut corners on quality. 2 years after acquisition, the original products are unrecognizable. Edward shook his head grimly. Richard would be devastated. Then we're agreed? I asked, looking around the room at our unlikely alliance, me, once adversarial brother-in-law and his wife, my longtime attorney, and several key employees who had known me for decades. We challenged Thomas at tomorrow's board meeting and, if necessary, call for an emergency shareholder vote. The nods were unanimous. Whatever our past differences, we were united in our determination to save Morrison Family Bakeries from becoming another corporate casualty. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with fragments of the past, Richard and I working side by side in the original kitchen. Thomas as a child, proudly displaying his first successful loaf. The celebration when we opened our 10th location. Memory and love and pride all tangled together, impossible to separate. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. I arrived at 9, accompanied by Barbara, and found Edward and Charlotte already waiting in the lobby. Thomas's assistant did a double take when she saw us all together but quickly composed herself. The meeting is in the main conference room, she said. Mr. Morrison is already there with the other board members. We must have made quite a picture walking in together, the family matriarch, the brother-in-law who had once been her critic, his traditionally aloof wife, and the formidable attorney who had represented the company since its early days. Thomas's face, when he saw us, told me he understood exactly what was happening. Good morning, he said, his tone professionally neutral. I see we have some additional attendees today. Charlotte is here as my guest, Edward said, and I believe Margaret is entitled to bring counsel. Thomas nodded tightly. Of course. Shall we begin? What followed was the most tense board meeting in the company's history. Thomas and his CFO presented rosy projections about the company's digital transformation and alluded to an upcoming strategic partnership that would accelerate growth. When they finished, Edward cleared his throat. Before we move on, I'd like to discuss the Pinnacle Ventures negotiations in more detail. Specifically, the plan to sell controlling interest of Morrison Family Bakeries. The two board members who were Thomas's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. The CFO suddenly became very interested in his tablet. Thomas's smile was strained. I think there's been some misunderstanding. We're discussing an investment arrangement, not a sale of controlling interest. Barbara slid a folder across the table. These preliminary agreement documents suggest otherwise. Section 3 specifically outlines the transfer of 60% ownership to Pinnacle Ventures. Thomas stared at the documents, then at me. Where did you get these? That's not the relevant question, I said quietly. The relevant question is why you concealed the true nature of this deal from the board and from your fellow shareholders. One of Thomas's friends, Michael, I recalled, picked up the documents with a frown. Thomas, this isn't what you described to us. You said Pinnacle would be a minority investor. It's a preliminary draft, Thomas said dismissively. Nothing has been finalized. But this is the direction you've been moving, Edward pressed, without proper disclosure or authorization. Thomas's composure finally cracked. Because I knew you'd all react exactly like this, clinging to the past, afraid of necessary change, unable to see the bigger picture. The bigger picture is quite clear from these documents, Barbara interjected coolly. Pinnacle plans to centralize all production, close at least half of the current locations, and reduce staff by over 70%. The Morrison name would remain, but little else. Charlotte, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Thomas, your uncle and I have researched Pinnacle's other acquisitions. They destroy the very companies they purchase. Is that really what you want for your family's business? I want it to survive. Thomas's voice rose in frustration. Don't any of you understand? The artisanal bakery model is dying. Consolidation is inevitable. If we don't adapt now, on our terms, we'll be forced to later on much worse terms. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw beyond the corporate facade to the fear beneath. He truly believed he was saving the company in the only way he knew how. Thomas, I said gently, I understand that you're trying to protect what your father and I built, but this isn't protection, it's surrender. You don't know the market pressures, he began. Actually, I do, I interrupted. I ran this company through 3 recessions. I watched chain bakeries come and go. I saw fad diets demonize carbohydrates and gluten. Through all of that, we survive not by becoming something we're not, but by being the very best at what we are. Edward nodded firmly. The company's core strength has always been quality and community connection. Sacrificing that for short-term financial gain is simply bad business. With all due respect, Uncle Edward, Thomas said with thinly veiled sarcasm, you've never run a business in your life. No, Edward acknowledged, but I've watched this one closely for 30 years, and I've seen the numbers from your modernization efforts. They're not promising, Thomas. Michael, who had been reviewing the documents with increasing concern, looked up. I think we need to reconsider this Pinnacle deal. The terms are much more aggressive than what was presented to the board. Thomas's other friend, Jason, nodded reluctantly, and the performance data from the reformulated product lines is troubling. Customer retention is significantly down. I could see Thomas realizing that he was losing support on all sides. His face flushed with anger and something else, perhaps embarrassment at being caught in his deception. So what exactly are you proposing? He demanded, looking directly at me. That we just continue as we have been. that we ignore changing market realities. Not at all, I said, opening my own folder and distributing documents to everyone at the table. This is my proposal for Morrison Family Bakery's future. Over the past week, with input from Barbara, Edward, and key employees like Frank and Julia, I had developed an alternative vision for the company, one that honored our heritage while embracing strategic innovation. I'm proposing a balanced approach, I explained as they reviewed the materials. We maintain our commitment to quality and traditional methods at our core locations. We explore targeted expansion through small format stores in high traffic areas. We develop a robust e-commerce platform for specialty items that ship well. And we create an apprenticeship program to train the next generation of artisanal bakers. Thomas scanned the document with a skeptical expression. This is naive. The capital requirements alone are detailed on page 7. Barbara interrupted smoothly. As you'll see, the projected return on investment is actually higher than Pinnacle's model by year 3, with significantly lower risk and employee disruption. One by one, the board members turned to those pages, their expressions shifting from doubt to thoughtful consideration. This maintains the company's identity while creating new revenue streams, Michael observed. And preserves jobs, Jason added. The workforce development aspect is interesting. Edward looked at me with newfound respect. You've put a lot of thought into this, Margaret. I've had 2 years of retirement to think about what I would do differently, I said with a small smile. Plus 30 years of experience in knowing what works. Thomas was the last to speak. He set down the proposal and looked around the table, clearly recognizing that the tide had turned against him. And my role in this new vision? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. This was the moment I had dreaded, the confrontation that would either heal our relationship or damage it beyond repair. That depends on you, Thomas, I said honestly. I'm proposing that I return as CEO for a transition period no more than 2 years. After that, leadership succession would be based on performance and commitment to the company's core values. So I'm being demoted, he said flatly. No, I corrected him. You're being given a choice. You can continue as Chief Strategy Officer, focused on the expansion and e-commerce initiatives, where your business education would be valuable. Or, if you prefer, you can pursue other opportunities. The silence that followed was heavy with decades of family history, pride, and the complex dynamics between parent and child, mentor and protege. Finally, Thomas asked, "And if I refuse this generous offer, if I continue with the Pinnacle deal?" Barbara spoke up. Then Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Morrison, she nodded toward Edward, would call for an emergency shareholder meeting. With their combined 70% ownership, they would have the authority to remove you as CEO and cancel the Pinnacle negotiations. Thomas looked at his uncle with something like betrayal. You'd really side with her against me. Edward met his nephew's gaze steadily. I'm siding with what's best for the company and our family's legacy, so yes, if necessary. Charlotte reached over and squeezed her husband's hand in silent support. Thomas stood abruptly. I need time to consider my options. Of course, I said. The board will reconvene tomorrow morning for a formal vote on my proposal and the Pinnacle deal. As Thomas gathered his things, I added softly, for what it's worth, I would much rather work with you than against you. This company has always been meant to be a family legacy. Your father would want us to find a way forward together. He paused, his back to me. Don't use Dad to manipulate me. I would never, I said, genuinely hurt by the accusation. But I won't pretend he wouldn't have an opinion about selling the company he helped build. Thomas left without another word. The remaining board members lingered, asking questions about my proposal and discussing next steps. By the time we adjourned, it was clear that my vision had garnered significant support even from Thomas's once loyal friends. Outside the conference room, Edward and Charlotte walked with me to the elevator. Do you think he'll come around? Charlotte asked, concern evident in her voice. I don't know, I admitted. Thomas has always been stubborn. He gets that from me. But he's also smart. Once he looks at the numbers objectively, he might see that my approach offers a better future for the company. Edward sighed. He's embarrassed. Being called out in front of the board, having his plans exposed, it won't be easy for him to accept. Pride is a powerful force, I agreed. But I hope love of the company is stronger. We parted ways in the lobby, with plans to meet before tomorrow's vote regardless of Thomas's decision. As I walked to Barbara's waiting car, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Morrison, this is David Nguyen from the innovation team. Hello, David. I appreciate your help with the documents. That's not why I'm calling, he said, his voice low and urgent. Thomas just ordered the IT department to lock down all the company systems and files. He's in his office with 2 people from Pinnacle Ventures right now. My heart sank. Thank you for letting me know. I immediately called Barbara, who was only a few minutes away. We need to move faster, I told her. Thomas is meeting with Pinnacle now. I'll file the emergency shareholder action immediately, she said. And I'll send a cease and desist letter to Pinnacle, warning them that any agreement with Thomas lacks proper authorization. Good, and contact Julia in HR. Thomas is locking down the systems. We need to make sure key employees are aware of what's happening. The next few hours were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers and emergency communications. Barbara's firm worked with remarkable efficiency, filing the necessary documents and delivering formal notices to Thomas, the board, and Pinnacle Ventures. Edward activated his network of business contacts, quietly spreading word that any Pinnacle acquisition of Morrison's would face significant legal challenges. By 6 o'clock that evening, I received word that Pinnacle's representatives had left the building without signing any agreements. Their legal department apparently wanted no part of a contested acquisition with the founder and 45% shareholder actively opposing the deal. I had just finished briefing Julia and Frank on the situation when my phone rang again. It was Thomas. We need to talk, he said, his voice tight. Not at the office. Meet me at the downtown store in an hour. The sun was setting when I arrived at our original location. The closed sign was already hanging on the door, but the lights were on inside. Through the window, I could see Thomas sitting alone at a table, staring into a coffee cup. I used my key to let myself in. The familiar bell above the door jingled, a sound that had always meant welcome throughout my career. Thomas didn't look up as I approached. Pinnacle pulled out of the deal, he said flatly. Their legal team decided we were too much trouble. I slid into the chair across from him. I'm not sorry. I know you're not. He finally met my eyes. You won. Congratulations. This isn't about winning or losing, Thomas. It's about saving something valuable. He gave a humorless laugh. That's what I thought I was doing too. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our conflict heavy between us. The bakery around us was quiet in the after-hours stillness, but the scent of the day's bread still lingered in the air. Why here? I finally asked. Why did you want to meet at the downtown store? Thomas's gaze swept around the space-worn wooden floors, the vintage display cases, the wall of photos documenting 3 decades of company history. I practically grew up in this building, he said quietly. Did you know I used to do my homework in the back office? Dad would check my math while waiting for dough to rise. I remember, I said softly. You were so proud when you could calculate Baker's percentages faster than he could. A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. Yeah. He ran a finger along the edge of the table. When Dad died, I felt like I had to protect what you 2 built, but also move it forward. Make it even more successful. He shook his head. I thought I was doing the right thing. For the first time, I could see past my son's corporate armor to the vulnerability beneath the boy who had lost his father and felt the weight of legacy on his shoulders. "Thomas," I said gently, "your father would be incredibly proud of how much you care about the business. But he built this company on principles that matter: quality, integrity, community. Those aren't outdated concepts, they're why people have loved Morrisons for 30 years. The market is changing though," he insisted, "but with less conviction than before. We can't just ignore that." "I'm not suggesting we do," I said. "My proposal embraces change, strategic, thoughtful change that builds on our strengths rather than abandoning them." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Your proposal is actually pretty solid," he finally admitted. "The small format store concept could work, and the e-commerce platform. I've been wanting to develop that for years." This small concession felt like a breakthrough. "We could work on those initiatives together," I suggested. "Your business training, combined with my experience, we'd make a good team." He looked at me skeptically. "You'd actually want to work with me, after everything?" "You're my son," I said simply. "And despite our differences, you're incredibly capable. The company needs your skills just applied in the right direction." Thomas stared into his coffee cup again. "I don't know if I can handle being demoted. Everyone would see it as a failure. Or they could see it as a family coming together to strengthen a legacy business." I countered. "It's all in how we frame it, Thomas, and frankly, your current approach wasn't working. The numbers don't lie." He winced at this truth, but didn't argue. "2 years," I said. "Give me 2 years as CEO to stabilize things and implement the new direction. You focus on the expansion and e-commerce strategies where your talents can shine. After that, if the company is thriving, we reevaluate leadership together." Thomas was silent for so long, I thought he might refuse. Finally, he said, "You really aren't too old to understand money, are you?" I couldn't help but laugh. I understood it well enough to build a multi-million-dollar company from scratch, and well enough to recognize a bad deal when I see one. A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Touché." He extended his hand across the table. 2 years. But I want it in writing that we reassess leadership at that point, with clear performance metrics. I took his hand. "Agreed. And we'll create those metrics together, so there's complete transparency." As we shook on our agreement, I felt decades of tension begin to loosen. We weren't fully reconciled, that would take time, and trust, rebuilt step by step. But we had found a way forward that honored both the past and the future. "Should we head to the board meeting together tomorrow?" I asked. Thomas nodded. "United front, it'll make things easier with everyone else." As we stood to leave, Thomas paused by the wall of photos. He studied a particular image Richard and me on opening day, flower-dusted and exhausted but beaming with pride, a very young Thomas perched on his father's shoulders. "I miss him," Thomas said quietly. "I wonder what he would think of all this." "He'd think we're both stubborn as mules," I said, joining him at the photo wall. "But he'd be glad we found our way back to what matters." Thomas nodded, then looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, something like respect mixed with affection. "You're a formidable woman, Mom." "I always have been," I reminded him. "You just forgot for a while." The board meeting the next morning was anticlimactic after the previous day's drama. Thomas and I presented a united position, my strategic vision for the company's future, with Thomas taking lead on specific modernization initiatives. The Pinnacle deal was officially withdrawn, and a transition plan was approved that would return me to the CEO role for a 2-year period. In the weeks that followed, we began the work of revitalizing Morrison Family Bakeries. The downtown location was formally designated as our heritage flagship, with plans for a teaching kitchen where customers could learn traditional baking methods. Frank Delgado was promoted to director of bakery operations, responsible for quality control and training across all locations. Thomas threw himself into developing our e-commerce platform with surprising enthusiasm. When unburdened from overall company management, his talent for digital strategy flourished. Within 3 months, we were shipping signature items nationwide, with special packaging designed to maintain quality during transit. The reformulated recipes were gradually phased out, returning to my original formulations with selective updates that improved efficiency without compromising taste or quality. Customer satisfaction scores began to recover, and by the 6-month mark, even the Westfield location was showing improved revenues. Not everything was smooth sailing. Thomas and I still disagreed regularly, sometimes heatedly. But we had established a new foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose that made those disagreements productive rather than destructive. 1 year after our confrontation, we celebrated the opening of our first small-format store in a downtown office building, a concept Thomas had championed and I had refined. The streamlined menu focused on high-quality grab-and-go items while maintaining our signature standards. "Not bad for an old-school bakery," Thomas remarked as we watched the lunchtime crowd line up at the new location. "Not bad for a modern strategy," I countered with a smile. He chuckled. "I guess we both had something to learn." "That's the beauty of family businesses at their best," I said. "Different generations bringing different perspectives, making something stronger together than either could create alone." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sorry I said you were too old to understand money." "And I'm sorry if I made you feel like your ideas weren't valued," I replied. "Some of them really were quite good." We watched a young woman in a business suit bite into one of our signature pastries, her expression transforming into one of surprised delight. "That look," I said quietly, "that moment when someone tastes something truly special, that's what this company has always been about." "I see that now," Thomas admitted, "and I see why you fought so hard." As we walked back to the main office together, discussing plans for our next location, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Morrison Family Bakeries wasn't just surviving, it was evolving in a way that honored its past while embracing its future. And I had proven once and for all that understanding money isn't about age, it's about values, vision, and the wisdom to know the difference between price and worth.